Okay, so
This meeting is being recorded.
wonderful. So just a quick backstory on Philanthropy Together. We've worked really closely with Grapevine over the years. We were actually launched one day apart in April and March 2020, which is incredible. And our mission at Philanthropy Together is to democratize and diversify philanthropy through the power of collective giving and giving circles. And similar to Grapevine, where we really care about getting many more diverse voices and perspectives into this work to change who gets funding and how that funding flows. You all know this, but I really like rooting in what we view as the beautiful definition of a giving circle, because I think it relates to facilitation questions. So a giving circle takes your mind, talents, and financial abilities seriously and makes giving a collaborative social experience. They create caring, generous communities of people who act intentionally, thoughtfully, and strategically together. So this only works if you have conversation, right? You can't do any of the things on this definition if you aren't having those meetings, discussions and conversations, and that requires facilitation. So in terms of what I'm going to do today is I'm going to share with you a number of tips and tricks that I've learned over the year in this work and suggestions that I have for you all as you think about facilitating your own experiences. So number one, you have to build your culture as a giving circle, and you have to build from that culture when you're facilitating. So folks sometimes come in thinking just about questions of facilitation, but this is really so much more than that. This is about what it feels like to be in the giving circle that you all are running. What is that experience? The facilitation of that is one element, but if you don't have a strong culture or an understanding of what your culture is, you won't be able to then navigate into strong facilitation. So the facilitation of your space has to align with your culture. What do I mean by culture? Think about this in company culture as well, right? It's everything from your values and your shared beliefs. You know, we have this workshop ongoing with Grapevine to develop shared values. That's something that we really, really encourage you to think through for your giving circle. It can be the language that you use to describe yourself. It can be who's in your membership, what your meeting style and structure is like, how you partner with the groups that you're giving to, how you go beyond the dollar, what the leadership structure is. Are there 3 co-leaders? Are there 10? Is it fully devolved leadership and everybody plays a role? What are the decision-making structures and the governance? So really think about what your culture is. And if you've never thought about your culture as a giving circle, this is the perfect time to do so. So here are a few beautiful attributes that you can think of. Is your giving circle, caring and collaborative and really about having that tight-knit feel with others in the group? Is it pluralistic? And this is really about amazing discussions from across different viewpoints and getting to a stronger place because of it. Is it learning oriented? Is it nimble? How is it happy and fun? So think about all the ways that your culture is part of this act of facilitation. Show of hands, do folks feel like they have a good sense of their culture or never thought about it? Okay, Janine says yes. Others, maybe, maybe not. Okay, I encourage you to think about it. It's always a good thing to do. The second tip I have for you is to really open up what you consider facilitation. So everyone can play a role and every moment counts. What I mean by everyone can play a role is that sometimes facilitation equates to sort of the sage on the stage vibes, right? It's one person at the front with the microphone or the pen, the facilitation pen, and they hold all the power. And in giving circles, because it's so democratic, that's just a beautiful way to expand away from that notion that there's one person who's holding the role of facilitation. Really think about the entire life cycle of the decisions that you make and all the moments in which facilitation is part of that. So every moment counts and everyone can play a role. Here are some key moments specifically in giving circles. So number one, at your meetings, how are you doing the grounding, the norm setting, the container building, sharing out of the agenda? That sort of first 5 minutes in your giving circle, you might not think about that as facilitation, but that goes back to the culture that you're building, and you have to set that right container in order to then be able to make the decisions that you want to. Then what does that relationship and community building and culture piece look like? How are you rooting people in relationships in the giving circle? If you expect to one day have a hard decision to make or a hard discussion to get through, you have to have those relationships first and center. So how are you making space for that as part of the facilitation, and how are you giving everybody ownership into that? The third one is what you might probably came to this meeting thinking we were only going to discuss, is the actual discussion and the decision-making moment, but really view that as just one of many. And then the last one, I think people often forget about, but it's almost the most important one, is what is the actual follow up and follow through with any decisions that are made, or with, especially if you're having a hard conversation. If, let's say, you don't come to agreement on something and you've agreed to take it offline, the follow through of taking that offline and continuing that conversation and looping back at the end with a decision or what that is, that's really important. And so that sort of facilitation is more about moving process along, hearing from disparate voices, that whole piece. So really expand your thinking around what facilitation means. Consider the type of decision that you're making. So there's many, many, many different kinds of decisions in giving circles. Some of them are, really fun and easy, like what's our name going to be? Or some of them, if you're, for example, using a method where you're more just deciding by pulling a name from a hat around who you're giving to, that can be pretty easy. If you're talking about more, everybody in the circle has to come to agreement on where our money is heading, or we have a big disagreement about two groups that we want to give to, or whether one of the groups, does that fall within our criteria list or not, or does that align with our values or not, that is not a simple decision. And so when you're thinking about facilitation, first analyze the kind of decision that you're making to then know how to handle that. So a few questions that you can consider. Number one, is the decision timely? Not everything is timely. Some things are, right? I've heard from folks who last minute heard something negative about one of the potential groups that they were going to give to, right? And they were having a vote that same day, or there was something coming up. So in that case, getting to the bottom of whatever that challenge was is really timely. And in that case, my suggestion is to really clarify the decisions that leadership within the giving circle can and will make on timely matters. If you do that up front, then when it comes to actually making those decisions, you'll have an easier time because you've already bought into and have agreement around what that decision-making process looks like. Another way to do this is thinking about a straw proposal. So, getting a quick show of hands or a quick poll vote around where folks are landing if it's a timely decision, and that can help you understand how wide of a sort of chasm is there between different points of view. And then I'll talk about gradient of agreement in this next one too. The second concept here is it a hard or contentious decision make, or is it an easy decision to make? If it's really, really hard, my best piece of advice, even if you have a big group, is try to gather individual thinking separately first. Then go through a process of synthesizing that and bringing that back, and then coming to consensus. Because what happens is that, especially if you have 30 or 50 or 100 folks and you're trying to discuss a challenging issue, or even if you're just talking about a challenging issue on your leadership team of 10, time goes so quickly. And when you're in these kinds of hard decisions, and one person will say something and then the conversation will veer that way and somebody else will continue down that rabbit hole, and then before you know it, 25 minutes have gone by just based on one sort of frame of thinking and one rabbit hole. And so to avoid getting into that kind of group think or that rabbit hole structure, it really helps to understand, okay, here's our hard thing that we're trying to work through, or decision to make. What does everybody on the leadership team think? Or what does our whole giving circle think? And do that through some sort of survey tool. And then from there, you really have the true disparate understanding of where folks are landing with their thinking on something. And from there, you can then figure out how to make a decision and move forward. A gradient of agreement, if folks have or haven't heard of that, is a way to test out how strongly do you feel against or for something, right? So it's hard in a democratic vote to know, are you raising your hand because you're just going along with it, or are you raising your hand because you really, 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 really love it and want to make that decision? And so there's a lot of different ways you can do gradient of decision or gradient of agreement. I think I have an example here. This visual might help some folks. So there might be a core of you that really agree. Then there might be some folks that agree, but have some kind of reservation, whatever that is. Then there's a bigger group where you can ask them to stand aside, that they don't feel strongly enough to block the decision, but they don't agree with it either. And so that's helpful so that those folks can feel like they really are walking away with their own sort of integrity intact, that they didn't necessarily approve of the decision, but they're willing to stand aside and are still giving their consent for that. And that's very different than a blocker. A blocker is somebody who says, I literally will not move forward with this. I would rather leave this circle than, agree to move forward with this decision. And those are the hardest moments where you are going to have to make a call as the leaders of your giving circle or whatever the case might be around what to do in those scenarios. And again, I would really suggest leaning into relationships on that one. One simple way you can do this, especially on Zoom, or if you have a lot of people, is like, gradient agreement with your hands. So 5 means I'm all in, I agree. 4 is agree with reservations. Same with 3. 2 is, I'm willing to stand aside and go away. And then 1 is I really, am blocking this decision. So that's one simple way that I've seen that done. The last thing here is who will be involved in making the decision. So one suggestion that I always make is go smaller as much as you can with your groupings and then come back to the whole. So anytime you have a hard decision to make, going with the entire group right up front is just going to be impossible. So either get that information ahead of time or try to figure out how to break people up through Zoom breakouts, or if you're in person, have people in groups of 2 or 3. You have a much better chance then of really understanding what folks think. And then from there, you can ladder up many different groups of 3 or 5 into what the group thinks as a whole. One point to make here is the difference between consensus and consent. And so that relates to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 I was sharing. So consensus is that all members agree and actively support a proposal. That's obviously the golden dream of giving circles, right? That everybody really feels good about it. It's also really hard and it takes time. And I know in 2023 with AI and everything else, like people are strapped for time. Everyone feels like they're on this hamster wheel. And so this goes back to my first point about culture. Are folks willing to take that time and get to that consensus place? Or is it more of this gradient agreement and getting sort of moving forward with consent, but not full consensus? So that's a small language thing, but it does matter in terms of how you're planning on looking at these decisions. One great tool, I'll send you all the link for this, is this handbook all about consensus decision making from this group called Seeds for Change. I'm just going to put it in the chat right here. And so here you can see that they've outlined a way to actually go through a consensus decision-making process. So I know the font's kind of small, but basically you introduce and clarify the topic. Clarifying anything you're discussing is really, really key, because if you don't do that, some folks might come into that conversation thinking we're talking about which group to move forward with in terms of our funding decision. And other folks might be thinking about, we're talking about a values discussion. So getting to the real kernel root truth of what you're trying to talk about in step 1 is really important. Next is to explore that issue and look for ideas for how to move forward and see where that, where everybody in your circle is landing. That's where you can use some of the facilitation tools to pull in different ideas. And then step 3 is the one that I wanted to highlight on this slide, which is to look for emerging proposals. And what I mean by that is that if you've ever been in work or in family life or in your giving circle or wherever, one of these conversations that just feels like, oh man, we're like, everyone has a different agreement. I can't seem to follow where the thread is. At some point, the actual facilitator of that space needs to put forth what's called an emerging proposal, which is where you can name, I am hearing blah, 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 blah. it also seems like there is disagreement on blah, 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 blah. So somebody is taking the initiative to basically synthesize everything that is being said up until that moment and name both the agreements and the disagreements. And one key role there, especially when you're talking about hard things, is to really refocus on the common ground that folks share. Otherwise, by naming where there's agreement and where there's disagreement, you don't want people to leave feeling like, oh, we're so far apart in our thinking on something. It's really much more about this common ground, and that's ultimately what we're trying to do. And then from there, you would test for agreement on that. So you can then, as the facilitator, say, I'm hearing most of us feel like we should move forward with group A, but there's some reservations about the fact that group B is really in need of the funding right now in this moment. I propose, based on this, that, we move forward with funding A, but we figure out how to rally our community to still get some amount of funding or support to group B. So there, I've basically stated a decision. And from there, you can say, how does this feel to our circle? You can use the gradient of agreement with your hands. You can use any other tool that you want, voting or the like, to actually test for that agreement, but it helps the conversation move forward. And so that is the one sort of front of the room moment where a facilitator can be really helpful, but this does not have to be the same person every single time. So you could have that role switch multiple times. You could do that in a number of different ways. So I encourage you to read through that handbook. It's really long, but if you're interested in consensus decision making, it's really, really helpful. One thing to mention in all of this, especially when it comes to hard discussions, is to really consider the hidden power dynamics that exist in any spaces that you're in. So even if you're a group of all women, right? That might be one identifier that unites you, but you probably have differences in race, in class, in abilities, in age, in geography, in your educational status, in even how long you've been in that circle, or if you're holding a leadership position or not. So thinking about those hidden dynamics is really important, because it's going to color how people come into these conversations, how safe they feel. This all loops back to the conversation about culture, right? Do you have a safe, inviting, inclusive culture for anyone on any spectrum to come into this? And if not, how can you proactively build that? When you're thinking about the hidden power dynamics, here's just a few ideas for how to move forward. You've probably all heard of community agreements. That can be a really helpful way of having sort of the clarity and that container up front to know how to move forward when you might have to call people in if a certain comment is made in a different way, or in a negative way, or if there's other power dynamics showing up. There's many resources out there for community agreements. I can pop this one in the chat as well. This is from Resource Media, and these are things like step up, step back, share gratitude for feedback. State things with an I, like don't assume everybody else agrees with what you're saying. Create space for multiple truths. So those kinds of community agreements is what I'm talking about here. And I highly encourage you, along with values, to think about what are the ways that you're setting up those community agreements in every facilitated space that you're in to create the safety for any of those hidden power dynamics. The second one is that building strong relationships really is the key, right? Like at the end of the day, we can get over anything as a society if we are built on trust and strong relationships. It's just often we don't spend the time making space to create those relationships. So I encourage you in every one of your meetings or moments to think about how can we take even 5 minutes of every meeting to get into a breakout with somebody that you don't know and answer an icebreaker question or something. And then the last idea here is to have a process to call in. So it's going to happen. Things are going to be said that you might not want to say it, but having a process to call in is really helpful, because then you already know how you're going to act when push comes to shove in a negative way. Otherwise, you might get into those situations and deer in the headlights, not know how to move forward. So what is the way, who is going to take that role, which facilitator, which leader? There's also something beautiful that I've seen in giving circles where there's a space holder, right? It's not the facilitator role, but it's the person who's really rooted in the culture of the giving circle. And their whole job as space holder is to make sure that everyone is included and voices are heard and the like. So think about how and who you can do that calling in when you need to. And also remember that calling in can happen in the moment publicly, and it can also happen after the fact privately. Both are often needed. So don't overlook how important it is to call stuff out in the moment, so you're not letting something fester or a bad vibe, seep into the circle. And also recognize that being called in, even with the greatest amount of love, if you've ever been in that spot, can feel really hard and challenging. And so come afterwards with a lot of love to that person and explain deeper around why you called them in or what was problematic or challenging. So a lot of this work is hard, but I know that that's why we're all in this, is to actually create these amazing community moments. Some helpful facilitation tools to get this all done. There are so many hi-fi and lo-fi tools out there, and I really encourage you to play around. Many of them are free. We use a ton of them at Philanthropy Together, and I think it keeps things pretty fun and engaging. So the first one that I absolutely adore is Mentimeter. If you haven't used Mentimeter, it does so many different things. You can do word clouds, you can do standard democratic voting, but you can also do a cool one is like a rank choice voting. So you can have all, top 5 groups that you might want to give to, and folks can stack rank them 1 through 5. And that gives you a more nuanced look at where the energy in the room is, because it's not just yes or no on 2 groups, right? It's like really looking at the stack rank. Another one that you can see here, who will receive our collective gift. Folks are awarded on the back end 100 points, and then they can give all 100 points to one group, or they can give 50 to one and 50 to another, or 20 to one and 80 to another. So you really start understanding that gradient of agreement that I was mentioning in action when you're talking about who to give to. And then this bottom one here is also really beautiful. It basically, the spectrum is from strongly disagree to strongly agree on any number of values. So this one, for example, was about, does this group reflect our focus and values? Does this group connect to the community that we are trying to serve? Does this group have a good track record in their community? Does this group have clarity of mission or project? And you can see here that in this yellow one, for example, the clarity of mission and project, some people strongly disagreed that they had a clear mission or scope of work, and some strongly agreed that they did. And so that's where you can then go back to that conversation and say, okay, let's tease out what the differences are here in order to move forward. Whereas in the top one, most folks felt like the group reflected the focus and value of the giving circle. Another great one is Jamboard. If you haven't used that before, it's like Miro or any of those really fancy Post-it note tools, except it's way, way, way simpler. And I think what I have found with Miro or forget the other one, Mural, all of those kinds, they're almost too complicated. And so folks don't know how to engage with them. Whereas Jamboard, literally the easiest thing in the world. So highly suggest you think about using that as sort of a virtual Post-it tool. Another one that I really love is called Padlet, which is, if you can see this example from another project that I was working on, folks can basically add these little tiles, but then within that, folks can also comment on that topic, and they can heart it. So that can be, for example, if you were having a conversation about what should our culture look like, many people could suggest different cultural attributes. You could all, as a collective group, heart different proposals that people made and go the step deeper and say, oh, I love what you said, Monique. Like, that's a beautiful, cultural attribute for us. What if we did that with birthday celebrations for everybody in the circle on a monthly basis, or whatever that is? So that can really help as a conversation structure. And then if you're going, if you're able to go in person, Post-its, voting dots, colorful markers, just think about how to do some of this work in person. And my number one tip with any sort of Post-it-y thing is use one color to signify buckets of stuff and use another color for everything else, because it really helps visually to understand, okay, there's a lot of heat when we're talking about cultural attributes of inclusion, and then you can write inclusion at the top, everybody sees it, and so you're helping to continue move forward with that decision-making process. One more idea, and then I'd love to open it up to questions, is to lean into the hard conversations. If changing the world was easy, more people would be doing it, right? So you all are here because this is necessary and it's hard. And so, don't don't back out from having those hard conversations. It really is the beauty of giving circles. I find at the heart of the day is, if you've ever had a hard conversation with a partner or with your parent or with a loved one or with a friend, you know that the other side of that hard conversation is often the beautiful spot. You have more understanding for each other, you have more agreement, you have more clarity around your relationship or whatever that is. So how do you actually do that? Number one, recognize that hard conversations are a gift and not a problem. Some people, I think, come into this work feeling like, oh no, our circle is not agreeing on something. What does that mean? What are we going to do? So don't do that. Think of it as a gift that it was given to you to engage in those conversations. It's most likely going to help you clarify your values, clarify your decision-making structure, clarify your leadership, clarify what you mean by your criteria of who you're giving to. Number two is to lean back on your values. And if you don't have a stated list of values, I encourage you to watch or come to one of our other workshops with Grapevine team around what values are, because values can really help when you're thinking about hard topics of conversation, and can, from a more neutral place, can help you facilitate a conversation around why are we making this decision? Why are we shying away from this? What feels so hard about that? How does that align with our values? I've talked about relationships this entire presentation, but I really encourage you again to think about and how you're focusing on relationships in your circle, because any hard conversation you have, it's going to be the relationships that matter to get you through that. And if you have folks having a hard conversation who don't even know each other at all, how do you expect that to work, right? So you really have to focus on relationship building up front, bank that social capital. So when you get to the spot of having a hard conversation, you have something to fall back on. Proactively discuss how to address conflict within your group, especially for you coming here from the leadership perspective. If you just think that nothing will ever come into conflict in your circle, you're deluding yourself. Like, it's going to happen. So you might as well go into that eyes wide open and say, okay, leadership team, if that happens, who's doing what? What are our values? Who's making decisions? What's our process for if something happens? What's the timeline to do so? Knowing that we all have full-time other jobs and other situations in our lives. So think about that proactively. And then the last one, it's just really easy. Don't rush hard conversations. So often folks say, well, I only have 60 minutes for my giving circle, so, we have to solve it in that time. Sometimes that's just not possible. And so throw out the rule book a little bit on that and know that sometimes hard conversations take longer. Plan, if you know the conversation is going to be hard, plan 90 minutes. 90 minutes goes so much further than 60. Even 75 goes further than 60. So don't rush it and plan for that follow-up. It goes back to what I was talking at the very top around, thinking about the facilitation role of following through, especially with hard conversations. Who is the person afterwards who's going to massage the relationships and bring folks back into the circle with love and grace if something came up, especially if that's interpersonal? That's what I got. Just a long, fast 28 minutes. I hope you all learned some great stuff, and I'm happy to walk through any questions that folks have, real life examples.
And feel free to drop stuff in the chat also if you'd like it read out, if you're not in a place that you can unmute. Happy to do that also.
And I'm just going to pop in a number of resources from our resource library while folks are thinking of questions. This first one is a list of icebreaker games and activities that can help with the relationship building. This one is a great video about how to facilitate group meetings and navigate conflict. This one is about values. Again, if you don't have your values set, that really helpful to think through. And then this last one is about collective decision making. And so if there's anything that I spoke about around collective decision making, that one's a really good one to work through. Somebody must have a question.
I have a question. This is Helen Jamers.
Go ahead, Helen.
Next Monday
Nice to
is
meet
the
you.
first, nice to meet you too. It's the first gather and grant event that I'll be attending. And I think it might be our group, and it's Worcester Women for Good. It might only be our second one, or Gabby might know better than me. But so it's a new leadership team. We've been trying to put things together. So my question isn't exactly around facilitation, even though I am the facilitation lead, but it's just logistics. And I know, Gabby, you answered a question. We had a question around when members vote. We decided we're going to keep the voting open a couple of days after the event because we have about 160 people in our group and only 23-ish RSVP'd so far. So we'll see. So we'll keep it open. But what do you do actually the day of the event, the in-person? So say we have 25 people. Do we actually vote that day, like on a device or using Post-it notes? What do you do with real-time voting versus after the live event if we're keeping it open for a couple of days? I don't know if that question makes sense.
Yeah, no, I would suggest you actually have people log in to Grapevine to do it. And if you pin the voting post at the top of the page, it'll be the first thing people see. And you can also, when you go to add members, there's a QR code. So some people print out the QR code and bring it to their live event so that people can just easily log into Grapevine that way. But I would suggest still having people use the platform. Sometimes people will like count the in-person votes and then add it to the whatever happened through the platform. But I would just encourage people at the live event to log in.
Okay, so at the in-person event, we'll hear the 3 pitches for the 3 nonprofits, but we don't necessarily have to take a live vote that day, the 25 people that show up.
No, you can,
okay.
Lots of groups leave it open for a couple of days after or whatever you want to do. Yeah.
Okay. And
So,
the
Helen,
other thing I was going to mention around, because we're still trying to figure each other out and our values and our culture and things of that nature. And so there's a couple of good suggested questions for networking. We might just put on the name tags, something like ask me about, and see if it sparks conversation and see the dynamic of our group, if they can start talking. Since it looks like only potentially 25 people, that's a small enough group. And if not, we'll have some papers ready on tables to start having conversations.
Helen, this is Amy. We're about to do our 3rd event at Madison Professional Women for Good. And we struggled with the same thing about keeping voting open or not. And just for comparison, we open our votes 2 weeks before the event to encourage people, if they can't attend, to vote ahead of time. And actually some people there vote ahead of time. But we close it right at the end of the event so we can celebrate together. I guess, you know, in the spirit of this culture conversation, we do try to celebrate with the people who are there to represent the charity. But we had a lot of discussion and, you know, weren't sure how to do that. So I just want to throw that out there.
Oh, okay, that's a great idea. I think we've been trying to keep a tally of potential options for a number of different things. And just because we're a new group, we'll try to be open-minded with our group, saying we're going to try things a couple of different ways, see how we like it, what works best. But I'll take that note and share it with the other leadership team members. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great point, Amy, about being together and being able to leave, and you know, after celebrating that as a sort of after gathering. So I love that.
Monique.
Hey, so I had a question. Could you go back, Isis, to like one of the first slides you had on like facilitating different parts of the meeting? I'm trying, and this might be a combination of engagement and I don't know, delegation, something. I'm just trying to figure out ways to get more people involved in the meeting itself. So, okay, yeah, that's it.
Yeah. So the first one, somebody who might be really good at like holding space or opening with jokes, or, somebody who has a really bubbly personality might be a great option for somebody who can do that grounding and norm setting and, make people really feel pumped up around what they're going to do for the next hour or 90 minutes. Thinking about this next one of the ongoing culture of the giving circle, that's not necessarily like an in the moment role, but it's more somebody thinking behind the scenes around, Are we having a welcome packet when new folks join the giving circle that makes them feel really celebrated and excited when they come in? So that might be a role that somebody could play who might, be a little less shy and doesn't want to take a spotlight role, but still wants to be involved and really loves culture and people. The discussion decision-making, that's a great role for somebody who's great at synthesizing, or who sort of on the spot can come up with that consensus agreement kind of agreement proposal that I was sharing, emerging proposal. And then the follow-through role could be somebody that's really good with details and project management and next step, or it might be the relationship builder person who, knows who people are and can go back and say, oh, hey, like I, noticed that you weren't as engaged this meeting. Like, I just wanted to check in with you. Those are the things that go a really long way to keep member engagement up. And you can have a lot of people do that role. Another idea to keep engagement up is to encourage folks to set up coffees, especially when new people join, like have a whole hosting welcome committee, schedule coffees with folks when they're first coming through, and really help understand how that person can then shape the culture and bring that back to the giving circle.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. Because that's exactly what I was thinking about, just how to maintain the enthusiasm throughout, giving circle, yes, decision day and like making, hearing nominees and all that is great, but like to keep people engaged the whole time. I love that idea of just like making it almost like a committee of welcoming and all of that. So that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. I think Janine, you had a question.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much for being here and educating some of us, because I don't know about anybody else, but I've been in corporate America since the very early 80s. And to say that a few things have changed when it comes to culture would be an understatement. So I always love and appreciate when new people come in and they're offering me tools, because my heart's in the right place, but my mouth gets me in trouble. I don't know if anyone else has that problem, but that's one that, and we have a wonderful giving circle of only 33 members, of which 8 show up consistently. So that's the level I'm coming to you with. But they made a request of me last time, which was, Janine, if anything happens to you, we don't know what would happen to the circle. So we're starting cross training. And that is another lovely way to bring in new members. We always say, you need to buddy up with somebody on the leadership team, sit next to them, because we are cross-training everybody, so everybody knows about it. So I just wanted to recommend that as yet another tool for super small membership groups, because when you start talking about hundreds of people and 25 showing up, I'm like, man, I wish. But anyway, so that's what we do with our tiny groups.
Love that suggestion.
We talked about this last night at our leadership meeting too. Even though we have 150 or 60 people in the group, there's 78 who haven't paid their quarterly amount. So I did send a bulk email about 3 days ago, and after that email, I still only got one person who paid it. So we were talking about, for the future, when the leadership team comes together, having some sort of reactivation campaign. And there's people in our group that are good at social media and marketing, so I'm sure they're going to head up that. So in the future, if I find out what we're doing, and I think they mentioned sending out some communication or emails like, we miss you, and show the progress we've been making. But yeah, it's a little bit misleading when you look at how much money we raised this quarter, because there was a quarter, I think, that got rolled into ours. But if you calculate the 78 people who haven't paid times $50, that's almost $4,000 that we could have raised. So just something on the side that I've been emailing Gabby about today. What do you do with members if they don't contribute after a certain amount of time? So I guess more to come on that, right, Gabby?
Yeah, one thing I'll just say on that is it's really helpful if you have unpaid members. Sending an email is great. Sometimes, you said you got one response, but really when you're in person, growing your group is when you're having that, that connection at meetings and people understanding what the group's all about. Imagine if just one person, if everyone brought one more person into the group, your group would double. So it's like, I think thinking about it, sometimes those opportunities when you're actually in it can be helpful, just to sort of, those are really opportune times.
And I would add
Hi.
that, there's a lot of obsession around scale and numbers, but if you free yourself from that expectation, how would that change your thinking, right? If you thought, okay, 78 people haven't paid, but so and so number of people have paid, what am I doing to really make their experience great? So that, I think so often this happens in companies too, right? Where you focus on attrition as opposed to really focusing on the amazing talent that you already have. And so I would just double down as much as you can to make sure that it's a great experience for those in it who want to stay and who then are more likely to recommend a friend of theirs to join because they're having a really great experience than somebody who knows what happened to those 78 people. Life has been really hard the last few years, and so it's probably not for a malicious intent reason, but just things happen in life. So think about that. Sorry, I thought somebody raised their hand and now I don't see you. Please go ahead. Was that Amy?
Hi, this is Teresa. Can I share with
Teresa,
you?
please. Yeah.
Yeah, great. So our circle has been operating for a little over 5 years now. So we're in a different space than maybe some of you that have spoken. We have over 200 members, and at any given meeting, we meet quarterly. We have about 100, 80 to 100 people that come. We also add the Zoom feature. So we meet in person, but they can come via Zoom. Very early on, I'd say in the first year to 18 months, I made the decision that I brought to our group committee that started this, that we need to, for sustainability purposes, we needed to establish bylaws, establish some guiding principles, and establish a board. So we currently have a board who kind of covers from a committee assignment all the areas that you talked about, the follow-up, the members that aren't giving, just everything, all the thought leadership, that type of thing. And I spend, as the founder and the leader of the organization, I spend a lot of time networking at other community events, almost every community event there is. And and being the face of the organization and profile within the community. And so with that, I encourage my board to do the same. And, so it's evolved over these 5 years. It didn't start that way on day one, but it has evolved. We have a pretty significant profile in our community now. We're pretty well known. And I encourage our members every time I communicate with them. In fact, it's in the tagline of everything: bring a friend, bring a friend. And they do. They bring friends and they talk about it. And we have drawings at the meetings for the new members. We have drawings. We have an annual big drawing of a vacation for the member that brought the most members. So we think about lots of incentives. But then there's the other thing that we really are talking about now, which is that retention strategy that I hear you alluding to. And part of what we found over our 5+ years is that each quarter we're currently getting 20 to 30 new members a quarter, but we're losing, there's some that fall off. So we keep them on our rolls for about 3 to 4 quarters, and then we put them in a holding pattern. But in the meantime, they're followed up with repeatedly. They're by phone calls, by emails, and encouraging them. And then we continue to communicate with them after we don't hear from them. But we continue to keep them in that, in our communication strategy. Let's put it that way. So all these things have evolved over the years, but I feel like for us anyway, that if there's conflict, and I use that word loosely, but I was listening to you talk about, and I thought that was interesting. During the meeting, there's not usually conflict because the meeting is pretty tight. It's run pretty quickly. It's really our leadership, and it's not conflict. But that's where we we bring up issues, we discuss them, we debate, we talk about it. We, all those skills that you talk about come into play during that. And so anyway, that's a lot of, that's probably more than anybody wanted to hear, but I was trying to think about all the things I heard talked about because we've had this experience. And with that, we are experiencing success. We're currently giving about $25,000 a quarter to the community. And so that gives us a little bit of clout in the community and a little bit of credibility. But we use all the tools. We use Grapevine, and we use all social media, use outreach tools. So everything you can think of, we use it to engage our members. We're constantly going out to have coffee and lunch and tea, and and encouraging them as well. So
thank you for sharing that, Teresa. I love that. And yeah, everything that I talked about today really applies to smaller leadership groups too. This doesn't have to be at the circle level.
Right.
And so you're definitely going to experience challenges there around what are the criteria of our giving circle, or what are our final set of values? Or I'm going to read Allison's question out loud for the recording. How often would you suggest circling back to group values like conversations? My group also struggles with membership, but I feel like some of our newer members have different ideas about how the group should be, which conflicts with some of the original members. I don't want the newer members to outweigh the older members. And so I think that's a really, really good question. It really depends on how often you're meeting anyway. Of course, you don't want to bring this up every single time, but clearly for your case, Allison, that is something that should be brought up now. And this is just as much around values as it is around culture, as it is around the structure and the process and the decision-making and the criteria for groups and what the Giving Circle's purpose in the world is. Like, what are you trying to do as a Giving Circle? So making space for that, if you are feeling that disconnect, anytime you feel any kind of tension in the group, that's a good place to dig in. Otherwise, I think sort of on a yearly basis, it doesn't hurt, especially if you're growing, to go back and say, here are the core principles for this Giving Circle. These are our values. These are our criteria, decision-making processes. These are our cultural values and norms that we adopt, and looking at that and seeing if there's any reflection on how that looked for the past year and how you might want to change it in the future. We have a few more minutes. Any other questions about facilitation, conflict, consensus building?
And I'll just say, I'll send a wrap up with all these amazing resources that Isis has shared in the chat. So if you didn't catch them all, no problem. I'll be following up with that.
I'll say something. Sorry, I got pulled away. Somebody was actually bringing me a check. That was good. This was great. Thank you. We recently had a little issue where people weren't happy with a charity that was chosen, and they brought out this whole thing. They only wanted to give to smaller charities, but nowhere did we say that we only give to smaller charities. And I was like, well, this charity is a great charity. And the way we handled it, you kind of made us feel like, all right, we did it well, we did it okay. Circle back, made conversations. Our group is very social, but some of you were talking about trying to get new members. One time when we were struggling early on and didn't have a lot of members, and we're still small, but we've been growing more lately. We just had like a happy hour at somebody's house where there was no voting. It was just, let's get together and talk and meet each other and bring a friend. You don't have to join. You're just, just check us out. And that was kind of interesting. People enjoyed it. So just kind of think of little ideas, maybe where if you don't have a social time where you can connect, because that is hard, I think.
Yes, I definitely agree with that, Lisa. And I think we've had a whole separate conversation workshop with Grapevine around criteria setting. I forget what that one was called, Gabby, but Lisa, if that's a further challenge to you, I think, Giving Circles do have such a beautiful opportunity to change and disrupt how who is receiving funding, because the largest nonprofits tend to get more of the dollars anyway. So how can Giving Circles disrupt that? So how can you all also lean in if there's interest of your members to move in that direction? How could you bring that to a full discussion? So I think there's a whole other workshop that you could watch around that piece too.
Yeah, the next one is actually on June 14th. So I'll put it in the chat now. And this is around we've titled it Nonprofit Selection, Defining Your Criteria. So hopefully that's helpful for you, Lisa.
Oh, it was so lovely being with all of you today. I wish you the best of luck with your giving circles, and I hope for the benefit of the world that you get into some hard conversations, because that tension is going to result in some good things, I think. So
Thank you
let
so
me know
much,
if there's anything
everyone,
else
for
I can answer.
joining. Okay, we'll see you at the next one. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Isis.
Bye, Gabby.
Bye.